Mrs. Borson back again for one last U.S. History 1 lecture for your freshman year. Kind of makes me sad to see this year come to a close. Thank you to those of you who are still following and giving it your all. Way to be a warrior. We continue with blue being the most important material to put into your notes. Please feel free to pause this at any time to give yourself the time you need to get this information into your notes. So we continue with Reconstruction, with social Reconstruction. And how does our country start to change the social pecking order that has been in place for so long, where African Americans are treated as if they are not equal to the white citizens of the country? The Civil War is over. Slavery is no longer allowed. I wish I could tell you that it was as simple as flipping a switch suddenly after the war. Everyone was kind and respectful to one another, accepting each other and their differences. But that's not how it worked out. Our country needed to make major changes in several areas. First of all, in their mindsets. White people needed to see African Americans as human beings and not property. This was hard, especially for the South, that had only experienced otherwise up to this point. African Americans needed to be seen and treated as equals, as human beings, no different than white Americans in the North and the South. If you recall, even though the North had abolished slavery ahead of the South, that didn't mean African Americans were treated fully equally there yet either. They still suffered a great deal of racism, faced discrimination, and the North had work to do in this area too. And as I mentioned in the political reconstruction video, our country started to make laws to help African Americans to become equal. We get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but those laws aren't always enforced. African Americans gain the right to vote, but it doesn't mean that it always happened that way. In fact, in the South, immediately following the Civil War, they started to make their own laws in some states known as black codes. White Southerners tried to control former slaves with these laws. Many of these black codes resembled slave codes or laws that were used to keep slavery in place. The Black Codes of 1865 to 1866 were intended to restart the economy while keeping African Americans from gaining too much freedom. An example of a black code from South Carolina had to do with labor contracts. While African Americans didn't want to go back to anything like slavery labor again, few of them had any land. The whites owned most of the land, and they had little money to hire workers. So the compromise was sharecropping. And the African Americans were pretty much forced into these labor contracts with their white masters. The landowner provided land, tools, a shack to live in exchange. The sharecropper, the black worker, also called tenant farmers, gave the landowner a percentage or a share of his crop to the owner. This is a credit system where much of this could be done without cash. Cash was a big problem in the South after the Civil War. Banks were closed. Confederate money was worthless. Many plantation owners had a great deal of their wealth disappear as slavery ended, and the value of owning enslaved people disappeared then too. Sharecropping might sound like it could solve everyone's problems. African Americans would have work, landowners would have a labor force, but doesn't it sound an awful lot like slavery all over again? In the end, when you have former slaves renting farmland from their former masters most of the time, the sharecroppers could never get out of debt. At the end of the season, the landowner would say, "All right, you owe me rent money for the land, for your house, for the equipment, for the seed." And usually it left the sharecropper with little money left over, or maybe even a debt that they owed to the landowner. And then the sharecropper would start another year all over again, hoping to have a better harvest. But there was always something, I don't know, maybe too wet of a year, equipment breaks down, too dry. When you live where you work, losing your job meant losing your house. So this really, for the whites, protected their labor supply while maintaining the white social structure where African Americans were inferior and at the bottom of the social ladder. And for African Americans, it basically is slavery under a different name. And sharecropping springs up all over the South. Here's a map showing just that. Look for the pink areas. That's where you can see there was most of the sharecropping. Could be anywhere from 35 to 80% of sharecropped farms in a county. If you compare that to just a few years earlier, where there had been slave labor, here's a map showing that. Each dot represents 200 slaves, with the darkest spots having the most slave labor. Now look back at the sharecropping map. Do you see how some of the patterns emerge and almost match up? Another example of a black code is that if you were an African American and you didn't have one of these labor contracts, you could be arrested and imprisoned at hard labor. And the county sheriff could hire out black vagrants to a white employer to work off their punishment. The Mississippi and South Carolina Black Codes of 1865 caused a storm of protest among Northerners who accused white Southerners of trying to restore slavery. In the South, the Mississippi and South Carolina Black Codes never went into effect. The Union Governors and Freedmen's Bureau immediately declared them invalid, but the damage had been done. Freedmen all over the South signed labor contracts and went back to work, and sharecropping became an endless cycle of debt for many African Americans for years to come. For a few years after the Civil War, as African Americans gained voting rights with the 15th Amendment, many of them exercised their right to vote. African American men turned out to vote in droves. Many core voters were black veterans, and they elected African Americans to positions in the government. During Reconstruction, 16 black men served in Congress, and 2,000 black men served in elected state, local, and federal positions. But all of that progress towards equal rights is short-lived. The South started to take control and disenfranchise or keep African Americans from the voting polls and keep them out of elected government positions. From 1901 to 1928, we have no African American members serving in Congress. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to greatly diminish African American voting in the South. If you haven't heard of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK as it's known, they are an American white supremacist hate group. The first Klan group flourished in the South during Reconstruction. They wanted to overthrow the Republican state governments in the South, and they used violence against African American leaders. They wore robes and cone-shaped hats to hide their identity, as this was a secret organization that terrorized African Americans with physical assault and murder. There were other similar terrorist groups like the KKK, Night Riders, Bushwhackers, but the KKK was definitely the most infamous of these groups. The KKK is still in existence today. It has evolved over time, but it is still a terrorist organization classified as a hate group. There were race riots, another form of intimidation. So Memphis and New Orleans had race riots in 1866, but there were other large-scale urban conflicts as well. In Lawrence, South Carolina in 1870, in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873. There was another one in New Orleans in 1874. In Yazoo City, Mississippi, in 1875. In Hamburg, South Carolina, in 1876. Southern cities grew rapidly after the war as migrants from the countryside, particularly freed slaves, flocked to urban centers. Cities became centers of Republican control, but white people didn't like the influx of African American residents and African Americans getting involved in politics. In nearly every conflict, white people initiated violence in reaction to Republican rallies or conventions or elections where African Americans were to vote. The death toll of these conflicts remains incalculable, and the victims were overwhelmingly black. There were groups that were called Redeemers. The Redeemers were a political coalition in the South, so during Reconstruction, they were an extreme group within the Democratic Party. They wanted to regain their political power and enforce white supremacy. They wanted to get rid of the Republicans in the government. Oftentimes, they were led by the rich former planters, businessmen, professionals, and they used the government to oust African Americans from politics and from voting. So Reconstruction doesn't go well, right? Our country still has problems left over from this time period today. Reconstruction fails because of the psychological reconstruction that is needed in people's heads. Rewiring generations of racism and discrimination doesn't happen overnight, or even over a few years, or sometimes even over a few generations. Plus, our country makes laws in an attempt to make African Americans equal as citizens with voting rights, but then these laws aren't enforced. It takes the civil rights era 100 years later to make those amendments real. And white Southerners resist change and find workarounds to keep things as close to the way that they were as they can. Plus, the country's major economic issues, Reconstruction fails and sets our country up for some major issues to come. So I end you with a final thought in your notebook. The North may win the Civil War. We hope you learned that from the Civil War unit, but the South wins Reconstruction. I hope you finish your classes strong so you can have a freshman year to be proud of, so you can set yourself up for success in the fall, whatever that may look like. Stay safe.